1909. That brings into play the vice-admiralty courts to a far greater extent, and to that purpose one was formed in St Helena in 1840. From that point, the colony almost immediately begins to be utilised by the Royal Navy, and it does so through into the late 1860s. The Navy brings 450 cases for adjudication there, bringing 27,000 slaves at the point of capture, of whom 24,000 or just over actually survived to be liberated. And there's a great deal really to be said in favour of using St Helena in this capacity. Effectively, because of the way the winds and currents work, you can reach St Helena from any point of the central or western African coast in 7 to 10 days with great reliability. And if you contrast that with the perhaps rather better known situation in relation to Sierra Leone, where inquiries at the time commonly stated an average of 5 weeks, sometimes 8, sometimes 11, and the mortality that goes along with that, with the recaptures which are on those ships. And just to illustrate that with the box plot which you can see on the right-hand side here, for St Helena, it takes an average of 17 days for a laden vessel to reach the island, some reaching there as quickly as 8 days, and the longest, 33, which is basically the minimum that you'd get a vessel from the Bights of Benin up to Sierra Leone. Turning now to the place itself, it's had something of a bad press. Largely that derives from Napoleon, who, for obvious reasons, of being stuck on what he described variously as a miserable rock, where there is neither sun nor moon to be seen for the greatest part of the year. His diary read, "Constant rain and fog, it is worse than Capri," which is perhaps not very good tourist. But, I mean, on a serious point, that has really sort of, because of ignorance about the island perhaps, and certainly up until the internet's made images of it much more prevalent, that negative propaganda has permeated into recent scholarship. So William Green's British Slave Emancipation, for example, describes St Helena as a barren and resourceless isle, and that kind of knocks on to the way that he sees its role. But the problem with both this image that I have here and with those descriptions is that really, you know, this is Ascension Island, so further to the north. It is barren, it is resourceless. St Helena is really, although it has volcanic origins, it's an older volcano, it's much more developed by 6 million years, and that changes the ecosystem kind of beyond recognition. And that came across very clearly when the Portuguese discovered it. They called it, you know, nothing less than an earthly paradise. You know, so I think the discrepancy between these over-dramatic accounts, which are sort of more out of sympathy for Napoleon perhaps, than the reality. And if we look at this 1675 map, it's one of the earliest ones in English, some of the place names: Orange Valley, Tobacco Valley, Lemon Garden, Lemon Valley. This is not a barren resourceless isle, even far from it. And then just to give you, you know, proper visual image of it, again, it rises very steeply. It is semi-desert in places of the coast, but in the middle, lush, productive, fertile, completely different to, I think, how it's portrayed, and how really in modern scholarship perhaps it's still perceived in certain quarters. And finally, to dispel the myth of this sort of backwater, again, its main settlement is modest, but it is nevertheless architecturally quite sophisticated. It is, you know, a British colony transported into the South Atlantic, but actually, as long as you don't kind of raise your eyes when you walk up Main Street and look at this extraordinary setting within the valley, you could be in Devon. You know, it's a very sort of familiar European architecture. So really, St Helena was a place that was distant from Europe. It lay firmly within the tropical zone. So according to received wisdom, its environment should have been malevolent to both settlers and visitors alike. But the reality is that it was totally benign. And this comes across not in these texts about Napoleon, but in very objective kind of government reports, statistical analyses. They actually kind of, almost to their own surprise, find this very sort of, as I say, benign environment. And the key to that is partly its climate, which is warm but not hot, with adequate but not persistent rainfall, but crucially, diseases such as malaria and yellow fever simply aren't present. So that manifests itself in a good life expectancy for the so-called native population, and also for imported groups. Its garrison has mortality which is actually better than that in England, and far and away better than, say, Sierra Leone or the West Indies. And many sailors, really from 1502, stayed on the island for a considerable period, resting, successfully recuperating before heading back into European waters. So if everything was in his favour, why then, if we look at the census of liberated Africans in 1850, it's quite a busy sort of lot of data there, but really the two salient figures I've highlighted in the light green. In the 1840s, over 15,000 liberated Africans received, but then this bottom figure, 4,760, reflects the mortality. So where sailors, where Europeans had done very well by St Helena, the liberated Africans, conversely, very poorly. It was worst at the very outset, between 1840 and 1841, mortality is running at nearly 40%. It falls to 30 at the end of the decade, but clearly that's still disastrous. Figures in the 1850s and 60s aren't so conveniently summarised, but we're still looking at numbers which are roughly around 20%. Archaeologically, that manifests itself in large graveyards which built up behind the depots themselves. Doesn't really show, it's rather a dark side at the top. That's Lemon Valley, choked graveyard amidst kind of invasive vegetation now, which we haven't really looked at. But here in Rupert's Valley, behind the depot, and you see in this map of 1861. Do we have? Oh, no, I can point. You have two big graveyards, one here, and then one right at the top, about a kilometre up the valley. And for those of you, perhaps who aren't familiar with the 2007-2008 excavations which were run there, we worked really in response to the UK government's plans to build an airport. Rupert's Valley is the place they intend to land the kit, but they have to drive a road through the valley to get basically to the one flat bit of the island on the opposite side where the runway is going to go. I find myself, as in 2008, as the bearer of bad news, basically telling some fairly high-powered people in the UK government that in the way of their prized road are these enormous and basically world-unique cemeteries. And then the archaeological work really, in a very narrow corridor, just essentially to facilitate the placing of a road through that. The rest of the road is basically designed to go round where the graves are. And those excavations yielded 325 articulated skeletons and a pretty large amount of what we term sort of disarticulated bone, so bone which isn't sort of, as you see here. And it's very stark, very uncompromising images. And I think we need to, I talk about graveyards, and that's a very sort of distinct term as opposed to cemeteries. These are institutional disposal areas. There's not ceremony, there's not emotion. You get occasional bodies which do have what, in archaeological terms, we might consider an orthodox layout. Mostly, though, in small holes, pre-dug, not fit for purpose and shallow, you have bodies thrown in. On the right-hand side here, this cascade diagram shows the most sort of densely packed grave. It's essentially kind of vertical storage. You have 7 bodies laid on top in a grave cut which is about 1 metre deep, and really, in kind of modern terms, we would assume one body would go into. They are basically getting bodies under the ground as quickly as you can. And it is a fairly damning indictment, to be honest, one of the slave trade, but 2 of the British failure to treat and kind of rescue these people, from their supposed liberation. And I kind of find it quite interesting that in people's introductions here, they've kind of talked about how they came to the slave trade. And perhaps they might disagree, but in many ways it seems quite a gentler introduction. Mine, as a Roman specialist, working kind of in a commercial way and as a generalist, come to the slave trade in a pit with a trowel, faced with kind of digging up children, digging up young mothers, and I think that has left me kind of catching up on the historical stuff, which perhaps in an ideal world one would have read before, but I think it does give an impression of kind of the shock that you can use this information for, and this visualization the slave trade, which otherwise really we had to get at through documentary evidence, where pictorial evidence is not that abundant. In terms of the diseases, the Africans who survived long enough to reach St Helena really suffered from the same range that afflicts all other victims of the Middle Passage. So if we just look at this snapshot from 1849, it shows really the range as interpreted by the doctors. Dysentery, extremely prevalent, and that's the prime killer in the depot. You also have very debilitating diseases like ophthalmia, which is a kind of catch-all for infectious diseases of the eye. And we can kind of mesh this to some extent with the archaeological evidence, although because osteology deals with the bones and not the soft tissue, it's actually quite hard to detect things like dysentery, things like smallpox. They simply don't register. But in terms of causes of death, top left, we have a couple of instances where we know people, or we can surmise that they were shot. So we have 2 musket balls, and have ballistic tests on those. A blind test which suggested that it ricocheted off a tree, which is to say a round object. The likelihood is therefore actually not a tree, but some kind of rounded ship fitting. We have protection injuries on the right-hand side. Those are healing rib fractures. We've got others which kind of attest to what in modern pathology would be called protection injuries, people warding off blows. So, it really does kind of back up what we do with historical evidence, but in a kind of physical manifestation. And touching on perhaps what we talked about in some ways about pre-enslavement conditions, or very early enslavement in Africa, we can actually see here in the porous legions on the top of this skull, these are very clear indications of scurvy. And what we found within the assemblage of the 325, that over a fifth are actually suffering from scurvy. But that really doesn't come out very strongly in the historical record. So this is where the osteology is kind of complementing and building on what we could tell. One thing that does come across very strongly, and that's the in the osteology, is the practice of autopsy. And that's really something, apart from this one sentence, which I found in the CO 247 series, isn't mentioned at all. But what you have within 3 of our bodies are clear evidence of craniotomies, where basically for some kind of pathological intervention, the surgeon has carefully sawn off the top of the skull, looked at the brain to try and determine cause of death, and then in this case, having done so, the skull has been kind of reunited, wrapped, and the body buried as a whole. What we also found, though, various bodies within undisturbed grave cuts, the bones themselves are well preserved, no skull at all. So I think we can assume that in those cases, autopsy has been carried out, some kind of severance at the C1 vertebra, and the head has been buried somewhere separately, or possibly, as we know from other practices, retained for study, although we have no evidence for that on St Helena itself. And in that way, the African experience mirrors the situation in relation to other underclasses, the English and the Irish poor, transported convicts, Aboriginal people, people with no voice, people with no direct kin. And whereas the 1832 Anatomy Act actually restricts surgeons' access to cadavers in many contexts, in a colonial one, the surgeon's in an ideal place because he can kind of prey, if you want to use that term, on these underclasses to carry out investigations. And one, Charles Rawlins, is clearly a serial dissector because he's actually told by the superintendent to stop. And if you look at the red circle, basically the rectangular structure is the hospital, and footsteps away is the dead house, the mortuary. And it's clear that, I think the Africans' perception of European medicine and the steps that it leads you to basically being dismembered must have been extremely powerful within the depot. The doctors talk a lot about distrust. The Africans won't listen to us, the Africans won't take our treatment. Well, I think there is a perfectly good reason as to why they wouldn't go near European treatment if they had any choice. The doctors themselves, the mid-19th century, it's a transitional time in medical practice. It begins really in 1800, almost closer to Greek practices. We're talking about Homeric medicine. But in 1900, we're talking about understanding of disease vectors, antiseptic and aseptic surgery, all that kind of thing. 1840 through 60 is a transitional time, so one of the things that interested me was who are the doctors and what tradition did they come from? You know, are they favouring the Africans because basically they're using outdated practices? The answer is, by the standards of the time, no. They're educated in the modern scientific discipline, King's College, Middlesex Hospital. The Lemon Valley doctor is educated in Paris, which is the absolute epicentre of sort of learning and teaching at the time. And we can also see in the kind of, so they're applying what we might term orthodox modern treatments. If you look at this, it's the remains of a medical chest from Rupert's Valley. So just from the top, we have wound treatments. So at the top, underlined in blue, silver nitrate. We have underlined in red, opium, typical pain relief, and at the bottom, henbane extract, again, another sedative used to bring on sleep. Very strongly present are kind of purgatives and emetics. That's the kind of standard way of treating, really, at the time. And then underlined in yellow, and there are other examples. We have mercury, quite prevalent. Things which are highly toxic, wouldn't touch them now, but again, they're a key part of the kind of pharmaceutical toolkit of the period. Unsurprisingly, perhaps with hindsight, these treatments fail. The doctors commonly express pessimism about their ability to treat their charges. And as you find elsewhere in the slave trade, they kind of also say, literally, their medicine is inapplicable to the Africans. It doesn't work, it shouldn't work. And essentially they despair. To some extent, that assessment is correct. Their pharmaceutical toolkit isn't really going to do anything. Opium is probably the most effective tool that they have. Otherwise, really, we're waiting for the 20th century, antibiotics, that kind of thing, before you can effectively treat many of the diseases that are present. If we look at dysentery, modern-day treatments would concentrate on rehydration. In more severe cases, you use antimicrobial drugs. And without the latter, disease rates really soar, and we find this, you know, in modern refugee camps. In 1850, basically the response is to purge. It doesn't address the microbial issue, and essentially it just dehydrates the patient at the very time that you need to hydrate them. So it's no wonder that it failed. And as those kind of traditional methods fail, they cast around for other things, and we find mercury chloride being used as a purgative, enema of gunpowder. You know, it's awful, horrific treatments, but I think done, you know, dare I say it, with sort of good intentions, but awful consequences. In terms of just moving on, and I'm kind of aware of time passing, I could talk about diet, which is an absolutely key part to kind of saving the recaptives, but time doesn't really allow for me to touch that. I could talk about logistics, the supply of medicine, the supply of clothing, basic things, but really I'm going to have to pass on that. So I just want to talk about facilities and the way in which basic nursing care and sanitation could have been applied. 2 depots are present, one at Lemon Valley, which we see here. It is actually a pretty clement place, but it's basically too small. But just by way of illustration of the way on St Helena that we can mesh physical remains and textual sources, the doctor basically wrote pretty extensive records, and he wrote them in that room there. And you can stand where he, if you're happy to point on. Okay. You know, you can stand in the room where he wrote the records, and for example, he talks about his gardens, which he used to cultivate fruit, and he talks about 7 fig trees which stand in his view, and you can still see them, the fig trees are still there. The graveyards he describes just in the valley at the bottom, and there is the second hospital at the bay. So in terms of sort of storytelling, of being able to relate document to physical fabric, I think St Helena offers really an unparalleled opportunity for that kind of thing. Rupert's Valley, which is essentially the replacement, gets a very bad press, but in many ways it answers for the problems of Lemon Valley. It's bigger, it's easier supplied. It is not a particularly attractive landscape, but some of the descriptions you know, this bleak and dreary place. Bishop of St Helena calls it God-forsaken, but he's very sort of, there is a religious context to that because it's all coming into the kind of conversion issues that he's dealing with. The problem is really not the place for the facilities. And the pictures that we see are of this kind of rather clinical camp, empty of people. It had capacity for about 500 people, of whom 200 could go in the hospital. It commonly had more than 1,000. At one point it had 3,000. 11 tents, each capable of taking 30 people, a small hospital. And Governor Ross's report really deals with it at its very worst point, which is a trap that one can fall into. But he talks about sanitation breaking down, and I think the thing that sticks in my mind, there are rats, thousands of rats, they can't control them. He literally quotes, they're feeding off the dead and the living without distinction. You know, picture the worst refugee camp of the modern era and take it without modern medicine, without modern logistics, without modern communications. And nothing was really ever done to improve them. This at the top was quite an elegant verandahed hospital which was proposed. The Treasury vetoed it. Instead, these tents, really, which were meant for 3 years, lasted for 30. And this one small building, which again survives in Rupert's Valley, is the only augmentation. But that's finished in 1864, really by the time that the depot was empty. So just to wind up then, for some comparisons, just to kind of, sorry. Place St Helena within some kind of context. In terms of comparative mortality, I want to be a little bit cautious because my research is at an early stage here. It's difficult to compare like with like, but the closest comparison of a liberated African depot to St Helena is the Sierra Leone one. You know, the subtleties are, it's more than subtle differences, but it's the closest. If St Helena managed to be poor, Sierra Leone, as far as I can work out, seems to be worse. In 1829, 57% of all admissions to the hospital at Kissy died. That's 271 out of nearly 500. Between 1838 and 1850, the average death rate was 50%. If we want to look for a slightly better comparison or a more favourable one, the short-lived depot, US depot at Key West, which operated in 1859, seems to do rather better, and the mortality there is about 20%. And I think, again, I'm cautious, but that may actually represent something of the ideal in terms of how many people you could expect to save with the medical facilities that you have. In Crimea, if we want a different, you know, to take us away from the slave trade, in one of the Scutari hospitals, 60% of the intake died. And again, that's not from war wounds, that's from disease. So although, you know, the British do get a bad press with relation to the Liberated Africans, it prevails. I suspect if you look at the US Civil War, which is more or less contemporary, you'll find the same thing. Concluding his investigation, Governor Ross made a rather extraordinary statement. I've repeatedly visited Rupert's Valley, inspected minutely into their state, the clothing, the food. I find it impossible to attribute their death to any neglect or any remissness whatsoever. It's an extraordinary statement. It is perhaps the best illustration of a colonial governor controlling information flow back to his political masters. My own analysis, I think, suggests it would be entirely wrong to suggest those conclusions. But on the ground, the doctors and the staff, I think, maybe provided the best care that they were able to give. There's little evidence for incompetence, for neglect, or indeed for the corruption which appears to have blighted the Sierra Leone Liberated African Department. As we've seen, though, those efforts were largely doomed to failure. But the culpability lies in the facilities, which precluded the possibility of basic nursing care, of cleanliness. They encourage cross-infection between patients, and they promote the spread of infectious disease. So I think in that respect, a lot of the mortality experienced in St Helena's depots could have been averted. It was a lost opportunity, and it's one that the British government and the Treasury very specifically needs to be held responsible. But if that failure originated in London, largely out of sight and out of mind, a few people knew, and actually I think when you look at newspaper articles, parliamentary reports, few people knew even fewer cared, and the decision-making is a very small clique, which you can boil down to perhaps less than a dozen people at any given time. But if those decisions are made out of sight and mind, as I hope the Root Valley excavations demonstrate, they're abstract decisions, they're dispassionate, but they have a profound and tragic consequence in a remote and forgotten valley in the South Atlantic. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And now we have plenty of time for questions and comments.